Please remember to like and subscribe for more fanfics. Enjoy.
Coil by Allegory Fort Hatred. This is Book 2 of Magic and Mystery. All rights go to Allegory for Hatred. I do not own this story. Chapter 25. Dazai vs. Pansy. They found Pomfrey's petrified body the next morning. Dazai got away with it, of course. He'd left no evidence behind, slaved over a puddle of blood for a whole hour, smelling like bleach, and had scampered out of the infirmary well before dawn. By breakfast, when her body was discovered, Dazai had carefully feigned surprise. He hadn't eaten breakfast and had acted too sick to try. Which isn't to say that Dazai escaped suspicion. No, that ship had sailed several months ago when the Daily Prophet decided to start calling him a demon. But there was nothing specific pointing his way, in the end. Dazai smilingly avoided punishment, which made for something of a perfect conclusion, really. Still, it was only a matter of minutes before the remaining students of Hogwarts started sending him glances and glares. And only an hour after that, Tracy was the first of many to outright suggest she wished Dazai was dead. Well, too bad. Dazai wanted that too. They'd have to bring it up with Mori, and that was a losing battle if Dazai ever saw one. Dazai thought about this now, leaning back as far as his office chair would allow. It protested his weight with a creak. Dazai paid it no heed. He was focused only on the newspaper spread out in his hands. The demon student strikes again. Is Dumbledore to blame? This paper had arrived via a fat and friendly brown-feathered owl just that morning. It had flown off without waiting for response shortly after Dazai cut the package from its leg. Tom's letter had arrived just in time to give Dazai something to think about, the public's reaction to the petrification of Poppy. The article had started off like all the rest, dismissive of the truth in favor of fear-mongering. Dazai is the devil, the magical community is on the brink, blah blah blah. The interesting part came about halfway through. During a press conference yesterday, the newly instated ministry branch, the Department of Education, suggested the replacement of Albus Dumbledore as Hogwarts headmaster, Rita Skeeter had written. Dazai threw aside the paper with a sigh. It slid across the desk, and only nearly didn't fall by a hair, stopping right beside his world's okayest professor mug. It was empty now, and had been ever since bringing it to Hogwarts. But Dazai still posed it on his desk like a well-won trophy. He held his hand up, hovering in the air over his head. The bandages around his wrist were especially thick today, and though Pomfrey wasn't dead, only petrified, Dazai felt like his hands were stained anyhow. These were the hands of a killer. The tendons pulled and snapped when he wiggled his fingers, and it felt somehow different than when he'd killed Quirrell last year. Dazai didn't know how to place the feeling, so he pushed it aside indefinitely. There were several other interesting lines in this latest Daily Prophet article, including his and Snape's rumored kinship and a certain feral dragon. But the news about Madame Pomfrey had by and large swamped them out. That, and Doe's call to action, fire Albus Dumbledore. That was fine. Dazai's hands were out of that mess. His more pressing problem was McGonagall. Dazai's eyes narrowed as he stared up at his hand. It blurred when he didn't blink, and a lack of depth perception made it hard to tell where the bandages stopped and the skin began. The day after Pomfrey was discovered, McGonagall had pulled him aside to talk. Dazai had briefly worried the idea that she knew, somehow, that he was responsible. That no amount of subterfuge or lie could hide the truth from a magical school. But luckily, that hadn't been the case. McGonagall had instead told him that his lessons with Snape were hereby cancelled, but she would be expecting him in 1 week's time for private lessons of her own. She'd said all this with pressed lips and a discerning eye, and Dazai was not blind to the fact that she knew about the Port Mafia. But whatever she was thinking, was seeing in him now, McGonagall did not say. But 1 week until lessons meant 1 week of safety before McGonagall decided what to do about his being a mafioso. Great. Dazai had 1 week to convince her to keep her mouth shut. Unfortunately, that little petrification trick of his would only work once. Once someone realized it was only Dazai's enemies that got petrified. Dazai dropped his hand to his lap. He'd figure something out. He always did. Snape was also a problem. Though less of one, Dazai thought. Because for all Snape could be pushy, Dazai had the man fairly under control. He fell for easy lies, and seemed at all times willing to side with Dazai's innocence. Dazai would figure something out for Snape eventually. But for now, playing his usual cards was best. Still, the whole thing was needlessly exhausting. No sooner did Dazai slump forward in his chair, did the office door suddenly burst open. Draco stormed across the room. He slammed his hands on the desk. The resulting bang finally sent Dazai's newspaper tumbling to the ground. Blaze, a few feet behind Draco, shut the door and ambled after him. "Good evening, you two," Dazai said. He eyed them both for a moment before grabbing his gloves from the desk and slipping them back on. "Don't good evening us, boss." Draco's palms pressed firmly into the desk, turning white. "What the hell? You're very noisy today, Draco. But as it happens, I have no idea what you're upset about, Madame Pomfrey." Blaze finally reached the desk, though he didn't make a show of slamming it like Draco had, for which Dazai was grateful. "She was petrified," he translated. "We were under the impression we had put a stop to those—" Dazai hummed. Riddle's diary was safely tucked into the pocket of his robes, and though Dazai didn't reach for it now, it suddenly felt more weighty against him. That diary was just the controller. "You know, there's still a wild basilisk loose in the school." "Ah." Draco deflated, his shoulders slumping and the mean twist of his face going slack. "I hadn't thought—" "No worries, the thinking part is what I'm here for." Dazai waved them off. "Without the diary here, there's nothing linking the petrifications back to us anymore. We're in the clear. Even if things are a little messy." Draco made a disgruntled face, still clearly upset over something. Blaze, meanwhile, merely tilted his head. "Draco mentioned you wanted to investigate the Chamber of Secrets," he commented. "Do you have any leads on catching the basilisk?" Dazai blinked. Draco did the same. "Oh, right. I was doing that, wasn't I?" Draco's stare was baffled. "You forgot." "Of course I didn't forget," Dazai sniffed. "I've just been preoccupied." Blaze and Draco were giving him odd looks. But before he could say anything about it, there was suddenly a knock at the door. All three of them immediately stilled. "Hey, think that's for us?" Dazai chirped. Draco shot him a wide-eyed look. "No one in the gang usually knocks," Blaze pointed out, and Draco nodded a wary agreement. They knocked again. Dazai got to his feet. He walked across the room towards the door, very aware of Draco and Blaze's eyes on his back. "Hold up," Draco said, hurrying after him. "It could be a professor." Dazai considered that for a few seconds. Then he shook his head. "Let's find out. Then shall we—" "What, Dazai?" Draco sputtered at his back. He snorted. "I'm joking. There's only one other person who knows about this place, and I'll bet she's here for the same reason you two are." Saying this, Dazai swung the door wide open. Ginny Weasley blinked several times at the suddenly open door. She had some kind of paper in her hands, and had been reading over it when Dazai greeted her. Upon realizing she was no longer alone, she hastily crumpled it up and stuffed it into the inside pocket of her robe. "Dazai, we need to talk." Dazai shot Draco and Blaze a significant look. "I told you so." Then stepped aside so Ginny could enter. She did so quickly. He shut the door soon after, glancing around the hallway to make sure they didn't have any eavesdroppers. It was empty, mercifully. Ginny hadn't been spotted entering their secret office. "Oh, Blaze, Draco, you're here too," Ginny was saying. She was hovering awkwardly by the wall, and hadn't stepped any further in from there. "Hello." "Good evening, Ginny," Blaze greeted. "Hello," Draco said stiffly. "Don't just barge in here. This is our office." Ginny's eyes snapped to him. She looked to be caught somewhere between righteous and uncertain, so Dazai butted in. "Aren't you the one doing the barging, Draco?" He eyed the desk pointedly. The newspaper was still fallen to floor from when Draco had knocked it earlier. I'm in the gang, it's different. Sure, Dazai flapped a hand, dismissive. I'm not intruding, am I? Ginny squeaked. Ignored Draco, he's just prickly today. Huh? Dazai beamed. What brings you here, Ginny? Ginny looked between them, apparently jarred by their bickering. But she straightened up a moment later with a serious look about her. Madame Pomfrey was petrified a few days ago. Is that… I thought you'd… Once again, Dazai turned to look onto Blaze and Draco. I told you so. Whoa, it's almost like you and these two share a brain. Creepy approximately, Dazai sang, feigning shock. At Ginny's confused stare, he reiterated. It's like I told them, evil diary or not, there's a basilisk in the school attacking people. On the bright side, Ginny, you're not responsible this time. Congrats. Ginny faltered, visibly startled by Dazai's cheerful voice, and her face took on a pallid color. She self-consciously rubbed at the back of her neck. I didn't mean to… We know, Blaze said, sidling up to her. Dazai is just playing… True, Dazai pipped. Actually, we were just talking about the petrifications. He paused. He had been planning to hunt the basilisk down, before Pomfrey. But would involving himself with it now bring unwanted attention? The last thing he needed was drawing a bigger connection between himself and the petrifications, especially not now that he was actually guilty for one. On the other hand, would not investigating raise Snape's suspicions? That guy had to know Dazai was always lying when he said he'd stay out of things, avoid things and appease McGonagall, or stick his nose in and act how Snape expected. Despite himself, Dazai's brows were furrowing in thought. Draco made a weary noise. Don't make that face. It's nothing but trouble. Concurred, Blaze said. Dazai blinked at them. I always look like this, only when you're up to no good. Dazai grinned, and Draco shivered. Ginny was watching them, shifting in place like she wasn't quite sure what she was meant to be doing. But after seeing she had everyone's attention, her spine straightened. Her voice was more sure when she said, If you're going to do something about the petrifications, I'd like to help. If you'll have me… No thanks, Draco said immediately. Sure, Blaze said. They glanced at each other. Then, as one, they looked at Dazai to see who he was going to side with. It's just… I owe you for helping me out, Ginny pressed. And I know you're a nice person, Dazai, despite what everyone is saying about you. Oh. Realization crashed onto Dazai. Ginny's words sparked something in the back of his mind, and killed two of his peskiest birds with one stone. I owe you. Dazai hunts down the basilisk from McGonagall. An exchange of services. I stop the petrifications, and in return you kindly don't mention that I'm Port Mafia. Up until he figured out a way to quietly dispose of her, though he was hardly going to tell her that last part. It was perfect. A win all around. Oh, Merlin, Draco grimaced. That face is worse. Don't do that. At some point, Dazai had started grinning like a lunatic. He dialed it up to 11 just to see Draco recoil. We're definitely, he told them cheerily, going to hunt down the basilisk. Ginny can join if she'd like, but she's got to keep it on the down low. Of course. Thank you, Dazai. Sure, he said. Give me a few days to figure out a plan of action. Or, make that a week. Let's wait for things to die down after egg first. Oh, Ginny perked up. She looked around the room, the rafters, the desk, the window. I was wondering where she went. Did the professors catch her? No way, Draco sniffed. My egg is way too good for that. She's around, Blaze said, vague. Huh. In truth, Dazai hadn't seen Egg since the incident the other day, though he'd caught brief flashes of her magical signature at the edges of his senses and figured she was enjoying her newfound freedom. It was fine. Dazai was actually rather pleased with this new arrangement, and therefore had done nothing to intercept her. Basilisk, Port Mafia, Mori's orders. These were Dazai's current biggest concerns. Everything else felt sort of paltry in comparison. I'm sure she'll show up again at some point, Dazai said, barely giving it any thought. Blaze scratched his chin. Though I thought she'd at least be wandering around Yokohama, not here, Dazai sniffed. Guess she can't get enough of me. He laughed tightly. Just kidding. Dragons are drawn to concentrated magic, right? She probably came back 'cause she was hungry, but she brought you mail. Didn't she? Ginny asked. That too. Ginny eyed him, clearly skeptical. And though Draco was making a similar face, neither of them commented on Dazai's evasive answer. Dazai was glad for it, seeing as he was hardly going to tell them what Mori had sent. Eliminate Poppy Pomfrey. Yeah, he wasn't going to be saying that out loud anytime soon. We're all on the same page then? Dazai asked, looking to each of them for only a brief second before summarily deciding. Great. I have some research to get done then. I'll grab all of you once I'm finished. Wait, Ginny suddenly squeaked. Dazai lifted a brow at her. Don't do that. If you're going to the library, you'll be passing by the Great Hall. Dazai blinked. Will I? Yes. Dazai nodded several times, as if he already knew that. He did not. Blaze frowned. What's wrong with the Great Hall? Draco shot them both bewildered looks. Are you joking? Professor Lockhart's club is today. His... What? Blaze asked. Merlin. You two share one brain cell, honestly. Blaze shrugged, indifferent. And Dazai beamed. Blaze is the only one here with brain cell sharing privileges. Draco is just jealous, Draco scoffed. You're insane, he said plainly. When Ginny smothered a giggle beneath her hand, he puffed up proudly. Professor Lockhart is hosting his dueling club today. You two seriously haven't seen all the posters he put up? Dazai and Blaze both shook their heads. How? They're absolutely everywhere. Ginny nodded, emphatic. She reached into her cloak and pulled out the piece of paper Dazai had seen her reading over earlier. She held it out for him and Blaze to inspect. I've been busy with... Dazai trailed off, making an incredibly vague gesture with one hand. With his free hand he grabbed the paper, a poster, probably torn off a wall if the glue marks on the back were any indication. It was garishly colored and boasted bold, capital text. An eye-catcher for sure. Blaze peered over his shoulder. And I don't care. Ah, classic Blaze and classic Dazai. What kind of answer is that? Dazai ignored him. Instead, he read Lockhart's poster. Dueling Club was the title. Then, learn self-defense with Gilderoy Lockhart. Never be scared of demons again. Defeat your enemies. Gilderoy Lockhart. He wrote his name twice. Dazai commented with a grimace. Never mind that. Draco crossed his arms. It's barely even a dueling club as far as I can tell. I've been hounding my father to get one of those started at Hogwarts since first year. But this is more like Lockhart is training our classmates on how to beat you up. Yeah, I picked up on that too, Dazai said. He skimmed the paper once more. Sure enough, that was today's date, and a time only about 30 minutes past. He handed it to Blaze for the other boy to read. He's too inept to even kill me himself. That is not the takeaway here, Dazai. Dazai shrugged. Blaze, who was reading over the poster with a blank face, said, Ginny is right, Dazai. You should avoid this. You think? Dazai asked, genuine. Blaze nodded. It's not safe. And you don't need any more bad press, Draco added. Can you imagine? If Professor Lockhart sees you anywhere near the Great Hall today, he'll never shut up about it. Well, that much is true. Blaze frowned and finally looked up from the poster. It still hung between his hands, folded and crumpled in an ugly way that didn't befit the otherwise colorful paper. He eyed Dazai. What? Dazai asked. His eyes narrowed, and Dazai's spine straightened under the scrutiny. Blaze was giving him one of those looks again. He didn't like that whatsoever. Last time Blaze had looked at him like that, it had been followed up by an awful lecture about trust and emotions and yuck. What? He asked again, more urgently this time. Why did I hear a but in there? Blaze eventually said. Draco whirled on him as well. Don't tell me you want to crash Professor Lockhart's dueling club. You two have no faith in me, Dazai protested. He puffed out his cheeks childishly, and Draco rolled his eyes. Blaze only continued to stare. Ginny looked wildly between them. What's going on? Blaze finally tore his burning stare off of Dazai to tell Ginny, once you've known Dazai for a while, it's easy to tell when he's planning something stupid. Here, he looked back to Dazai. You want to go to the dueling club? Dazai threw his hands up, feigning shock. Whoa, you caught me. Are you suicidal? Everyone there is learning how to attack you, Draco spat. Dazai smiled sunnily. Yeah, it sounds fun, Ginny choked. That dreadful emotion in Blaze's eyes darkened. Dazai quickly pivoted. Anyway, won't Lockhart be sad if his villain doesn't make an appearance? Imagine all of his fans when this chapter of his stupid book doesn't write itself. All those teary-eyed prepubescent brats will be my fault. Since when do you care what that guy is feeling? Since he started a murder Dazai club, I think. Mori's voice echoed in his head, as did a dizzying feeling like he was dancing the waltz. Make them fear you. This dueling club was an opportunity shining gold and inviting. He'd be stupid not to grab it. Ginny and Draco both shifted uncomfortably at Dazai's candid answer, but Dazai steamrolled over them. I'm only going to check it out, he said while clicking his tongue. You can't convince me otherwise. I'm really going no matter what you say. Blaze lifted a brow. What happened to waiting for things to die down? He asked, not so subtly prodding Dazai in the side with an elbow. That's different, Dazai told him. He couldn't tell them that Mori had all but asked him to make trouble, or that the egg fiasco had caught him completely off guard, and he was only trying to take back a little ground of his own. At the series of blank looks he was receiving, Dazai eventually explained, Lockhart and I have some kind of hero-villain dynamic. I ought to make a grand entrance for him at some point. They all gave him weird looks. Blaze is the blankest and therefore most concerning of the lot. Having had enough of this conversation by a mile, Dazai promptly opened the office door and stepped out into the empty hallway. Hey! Draco shouted, then he was hurrying after Dazai. A second later, Ginny and Blaze were doing the same. Draco started. But it must have been obvious that Dazai wouldn't be stopping anytime soon. He sighed, big and heavy, and gruntingly told Dazai, Where are you trying to go? The Great Hall isn't that way at all. Dazai whirled around to face them, eyes wide and bewildered. Seriously? Before they even reached the Great Hall, Dazai could hear it. Lockhart's booming voice calling out, Now, students, just like I showed you. Followed by a chorus of yes, sir, and a single stray, you didn't show us anything, you dolt. But it was loud enough that before Draco had even shown them around the last corner, Dazai already knew they'd reached their destination. It had him instantly on edge. Loud noises had always bothered him, crowded spaces more so, and it was looking more and more like Lockhart's stupid club was going to be both of those things. Joy. Add the fact that Lockhart was here as the cherry on top and, well, it was a good thing Dazai had spent some amount of his first year practicing self-restraint, because he was already itching to incendio something right now. When the door to the Great Hall finally came into view, Draco cleared his throat. You three go in without me. Dazai lifted a brow. Even though the cacophony of the dueling club was surely loud enough to smother his voice, Dazai still replied in a muted tone. Stage fright? He teased. Draco shot him a quelling look. I don't want to be seen wandering around with you lot, he corrected a bit meanly. I'll follow in a few minutes, so no one thinks we were together. Dazai placed a hand over his heart in mock offense. If you don't mind me asking, Ginny squeaked. Draco glanced at her with a look that clearly said, I do mind, but go ahead. Why weren't you already at the Great Hall? If you've always wanted a dueling club, I mean. Unexpectedly, Draco's cheeks heated and he looked away. Blaze tilted his head. Well, he was busy hanging out with Dazai and me, right? What, I guess. But don't say it like that, Blaze, Draco protested. You make me sound mushy. Blaze nodded shrewdly. Suddenly, Lockhart's voice echoed out from the Great Hall. Dazai clamped a hand over one ear to smother the boom even slightly. Very good, Miss Granger. 10 points to Ravenclaw. Wait, you're Gryffindor, aren't you, girl? Dazai perked up. Hermione joined the club? Ginny spun to face Dazai. I think Luna went as well. She blinked, then hastily amended, "And not to spite you or anything. She said she was protesting." Dazai snorted. Imagining Luna arguing with Lockhart about exorcists was an undeniably amusing image. He shook his head to dislodge the thought and said to Draco, "You should find Pansy, I bet she's here. You three aren't still fighting, are you?" Here he looked to Blaze as well. When he really thought back on these last several days, Dazai couldn't recall ever having seen the three of them together. It was strange, considering before winter break, they were a trio all their own discounting when Blaze saw fit to sit with Dazai instead, or when Draco snuck off to do the same. Though if Dazai was being honest, he hadn't been the most observant person these last few days, too caught up in his own head, running over the mess that was Mori's latest missive. He ought to remedy that lapse, if he didn't want Mori yelling at him come May. Draco's face twisted painfully. Guess things were still sore between them then. Dazai shrugged internally. The less Pansy the better, he thought. Still or not, he said, non-committal. But if you want to see if her gang is planning anything, I won't stop you. Draco's expression pinched, looking slightly offended. Blaze beside him lifted a solitary brow. But Draco only folded his arms over his chest and stiffly said, "She won't plan anything else." "Else?" Ginny squeaked. It had been several months now, and Dazai's cheek no longer stung painfully at the memory of Crab's fist embedding itself there. He rolled his shoulders. "I'm going to sneak in then," Dazai told them cheerily. "You all behave yourselves now." He turned, on his feet to skip off to the Great Hall, and a second later the hurried footsteps of Ginny and Blaze joined him, albeit with less cheer. Understandably, Dazai was laying it on a little thick. He waved a quick goodbye to Draco, and made a silent promise to look for the other boy in the crowd a bit later. But first, when they got to the main door, Dazai slowed his pace abruptly. Ginny and Blaze followed suit. Eventually he came to a stop just at the edge of the door, sneakily peeking around the wall. It was still obnoxiously noisy in the Great Hall, and now Dazai could see why. It must have been almost every student in there. The Great Hall was big, and many of the students hadn't returned for second semester, but there was still a massive swarm of kids taking up space there. They were lined up in seemingly arbitrary pairs and pointing their wands at one another. The only thing making room for everyone was that all the tables had been pushed aside to the edges of the hall. It didn't take long for Dazai to find Hermione. She was close to the front of the room, practicing with an older Ravenclaw girl Dazai didn't know. Even from here, Dazai could feel the zing of magic when she flicked her wand. A second later, the Ravenclaw's pale, stumpy wand suddenly flew out of her hands and clattered against the floor several feet to her left. Lockhart was standing by them, grinning and sparkling and what else. And, oh! Dazai bounced on his heels. "Snape is here." He squinted. Why is Snape here? Sure enough, Professor Snape was standing stiff as a statue near the back wall. His arms were crossed tight over his chest, and his glare was drilling a hole in the back of Lockhart's head. If Dazai didn't know any better, he might think Snape was a mafioso himself, with that kind of malicious aura. Supervising lessons? Ginny guessed. She was on the tips of her toes trying to peek around Dazai without leaving her cover behind him. Supervising Professor Lockhart? Blaze tossed his own 2 cents in. Dazai snorted. Judging by that mean glare? Definitely the latter. After a moment, Dazai saw fit to tell them this, and Ginny made a sound that might have been a sigh. A part of Dazai itched to say hello to his favorite curmudgeonly professor, but the rest of his good sense kept his feet rooted in place. Snape knew about the Port Mafia now, and had promptly cancelled all of their remedial lessons. Dazai frowned, observing Snape from across the room, and worked at his tongue with his teeth. Snape always had Dazai's back in the end, and he didn't think that was any less true now. But the gulf of the Port Mafia sat between them now and, oddly, that curdled something in his stomach to think about. Absent-mindedly, Dazai scratched at his wrist, but the bandages were so thick he barely even felt it, and he soon dropped his hands with a dissatisfied breath. The cuts underneath were healed over by now and no longer bled when agitated, but they itched like nothing else. a quiet nagging always at the corner of his thoughts. He couldn't scratch them, though, or risk opening them up again. Dazai. He blinked out of his thoughts to glance at Blaze. What are you thinking? He asked, paused, then asked instead. Are you okay? Dazai's nose scrunched up. I'm trying to figure out what spell that is, he lied. Blaze made a face that said nothing at all. Then he opened his mouth to say, Expelliarmus. The disarming charm a new voice interrupted. Dazai recoiled. He nearly fell into the great hall, if it weren't for Blaze's quick hands pulling him upright. Ginny shrilled and jumped about a half-foot into the air. Percy Weasley eyed them coolly from across the hall. His gaze lingered on Dazai for a few long seconds before moving to Blaze and Ginny. Percy had one hand on his hip, and he wore a closed-off, contemplative expression. He lifted the other hand in a pacifying jejuttre. Apologies, he said, sincere, and took several steps forward until he was no longer a looming figure at the end of the corridor. I didn't mean to startle you all. Are you okay? Percy. Ginny yipped. You scared me. Don't creep around like that. He smiled Smally fondly. As I said, my apologies. Ginny pouted. Though, Percy said. Once again that pensive expression was back on his face when he looked to Dazai and Blaze. You should expect to be startled, sneaking around like you are. What are you doing? Miraculously, everyone turned their eyes onto Dazai to answer. He grinned and took a purposeful step out of the great hall's line of sight just in case. Joining Lockhart's dueling club, Dazai told him. This was mostly true, but Percy still made a face like he didn't believe it. Dazai propped both hands up on his hips. What about you? Shouldn't Percy be in there, learning how to Expelliarmus children? Percy grimaced, his eyes flicking off to the side for a brief, uncomfortable moment. He cleared his throat and said, I do not. Approve of Professor Lockhart's dueling club, he gave a look that Dazai supposed was meant to be conciliatory. So I'm patrolling the area. It seems my efforts have paid off. Now tell me what you three are doing sneaking around out here. Percy, Ginny scolded. When she spoke to Percy, Dazai realized she wore a different tone of voice. This Ginny was argumentative and confident, not at all the uncertain Ginny that had shakingly told him about Riddle's diary, nor even the Ginny who had knocked on his office door just that morning. We're really just looking around. Right, Percy said. He eyed Dazai. It was difficult to hear him over the sound coming from the great hall. Dazai is my friend, she said ardently. Percy said nothing to this, just narrowed his eyes at them. I want to learn that spell, Dazai cut in, not liking the look Percy was giving him and wishing to distract it. He indicated to the great hall with a thumb. But I also don't want to get mauled yet, so we're sneaking around the edges for now. I'm sure your friends can teach you, Percy said, eyes flicking to the great hall and back warily. Something pressed between his brows, and he conceded an uncertain, you're right, it isn't safe for you here. Go back to wherever it is you hang out all day and night. Dazai frowned. You mean the dorms? Percy blinked several times. Hastily, he said, yes, the dorms. Blaze briefly met Dazai's eyes. A line of silent communication passed between them, and Blaze promptly dug his heels in. As a prefect, should you really be denying a student his education? What? Percy stared. He shook his head, disbelieving. Yeah, Dazai agreed. I'm going to flunk out because of you. Specifically, you're going to flunk out because you don't do your homework, Percy told him, clearly exasperated with their antics. If you need a tutor, Dazai blew a raspberry. Percy's mouth clicked shut. From the great hall, an excited cheer rose up. I did it! I did it! Congratulations, children. You're not quite at my level, but it was an admirable attempt, Lockhart said. Dazai rolled his eye. Well, someone had to knock Lockhart down a peg. He rolled his shoulders and fixed the hang of Mori's coat over him. Between the coat, the tangle of bandages over his eye, and the annoyed look tightening his face, Dazai figured he probably looked a mean picture. Scarier even than that shadow figure the Daily Prophet used to advertise in his place, before they had a picture of him. Ever on the same page, Blaze straightened beside him. It was evident the exact moment Percy and Ginny realized that Dazai was about to go running in, because they also tensed up, though not in the same readied way that Blaze had. They looked like they were watching a plane crash in real time. "Mr. Dazai," Percy said carefully, "if you go in there, I cannot guarantee you will not be hurt. Did you read the poster?" Ginny's hand raised to her chest, where the poster was again folded up and pocketed. "He knows what the club is about, Percy. And you still." "I'm going to check it out," Dazai said. He beamed at Blaze. "Ready to make a grand entrance?" "I don't do grand entrances. First time for everything." Percy reached out to stop him. "Dazai, wait." But it was too late. Dazai had already made up his mind, and had started on a dead-set path straight into the Great Hall. It was noisier inside. That was the first thing Dazai noticed. Out in the hallway, the clamor was just that clamor. A big, continuous bang, of voices coalescing into something loud and indecipherable. It reminded Dazai a lot of the Quidditch match he'd attended a few months ago. Loud shouting that coming up from the crowd that sounded less like words and more like a massive beast growling. Now that he was close enough to not only make out coherent conversations, but to feel the sting of all their cast spells simultaneously. If dealing with Lockhart didn't give him a headache, Dazai was sure everyone else would. Still, he must have done a good job keeping the pained grimace from his face, because for once Blaze didn't make some remark about it. It was easier to sneak into the club than Dazai had initially anticipated. The students were busy practicing spells in pairs, and only occasionally looked away to gather up their fallen wands from the floor. That, and the noisy excitement in the air, kept people from turning when Dazai entered. Just another student arriving to learn the disarming charm, they probably thought, not the object of all their anger. Regardless, it kept Dazai's grand entrance less than grand. After a few seconds of observing the crowd, Blaze gently nudged Dazai. Once he had Dazai's attention, he inclined his head towards one of the groups in particular. Dazai followed his gaze. Pansy. She had her arms crossed stiffly over her chest, wand nowhere to be seen. Tracy and Millie were practicing in a duo off to her right. In the time Dazai watched them, Millicent had successfully cast Expelliarmus twice, while Tracy had yet to even manage it once. Her cheeks were a bright tomato red that Dazai could see all the way across the room. On Pansy's other side, Crabbe and Coil were paired up. But even from this distance, Dazai could see they were actually just playing rock, paper, scissors. Snape was standing nearby, rubbing at his forehead agitatedly. "Oh." Ginny bounced on her heels. "I see Luna. I'm gonna say hi." Dazai turned just in time to watch Ginny dash away into the crowd. He spotted her again a few seconds later. The pale-haired head of Luna Lovegood just barely peeked over the cluster of students by the far wall. But Dazai could see how she perked up when Ginny arrived, and a second later she stretched up on her toes to wave wildly in Dazai's direction. Dazai lifted a hand in return. "Just us now," Blaze said, and a quick glance around revealed that Draco had yet to make his own appearance. "Want to find Hermione?" Still over by Lockhart, Dazai really didn't want to talk with her right now, but looking around, she was the only other hound present at Lockhart's lesson. The twins weren't around, and neither was Ron. Searching for his friends, Dazai's eyes nearly skipped over the mop of ginger hair lingering by the door. Upon catching Dazai's eyes, Percy quickly looked away to observe the other students. So he was done wandering the halls, now? Dazai's eyes narrowed, but his chance to silently observe Percy was stolen away just a second later. "He's here!" Dazai's head whipped so fast, his neck strained, and just as Dazai had hurried to find the source of the screams somewhere near Luna, had they seen her wave? So too did everyone else. Dazai changed his mind. The Great Hall wasn't pandemonium before. It was now, screaming from every corner of the room, panicked and threatening. "The demon! Quick! Try the spells we learned. Chase him out. Ah, I don't know the spell yet. Forget spells, just throw your wand at him." A single wand shot out of the crowd. It missed Dazai by several feet and clattered uselessly against his shoe. "Students!" Percy hollered. He appeared at Dazai's side and briefly met the mafioso's eye before taking a firm step in front of him. Percy held a single hand out in front of him, unyielding. "That's quite enough of that." "He can't be here," someone in the crowd roared disagreement. "This is meant to be a safe place," another yelled. "Yeah, we're doing everyone a favor chasing him out." Another wave of clamor echoed this. "He is a student," Percy growled, "just as you all are. And if I see you attacking him one more time, oh, come on. Everyone knows he's guilty of everything. It's only because he's Professor Snape's son that he's even still alive. Otherwise, Lockhart would have killed him by now." Several people laughed in the crowd. Percy full body recoiled. Beside him, Blaise suddenly grabbed Dazai's hand and pulled. Dazai couldn't take his eyes off the swarm of angry students, the threats all around. After a few attempts, Blaise stopped trying to pull him into the hall, and instead only held Dazai's hand in silent support. Then, that is enough. The entire great hall went dead silent. Snape stormed through the crowd. He parted it with every stomping step, with every glare. The malice in his expression was doubled what it had been earlier. His brows at a sharp, angry angle, his lips so curled Dazai could see bared teeth. And the fire in his eyes, Dazai didn't shiver. He had seen worse. But he saw, around the entire room, everyone take in a collective breath. A beast had just woken in the depths of Snape's eyes. "Sir," Percy said with a measured voice. Snape's eyes snapped to him, and Percy's back straightened painfully straight. But he drew his shoulders in a second later. A stone wall. The hush of the great hall only made his next words feel all the more significant. "Sir, I believe this club to be unsafe as it is now. Any club that exists solely to antagonize a student is not permitted at Hogwarts on the basis of harassment." Snape stared at Percy for a long moment, his expression unreadable except for the burning anger. Percy cleared his throat and continued, At least let me escort Mr. Dazai away." Another moment passed, a quiet murmur amongst the students. Snape's eyes flicked to Dazai. He was still half-ducked behind Percy, but when their eyes met, something strange shifted on Snape's face. He looked away very quickly. To Percy, he said, "Get him out of here." "What? I knew it. He is Dazai's dad." Snape whirled on the crowd. "Practice your spells quietly or I expel all of you." Several people shrieked. Hermione's the shrillest amongst them. Percy watched the crowd for another long moment. It was evident that no one would be resuming their club until Dazai left. Despite Snape's command, everyone was still standing together, glaring daggers his way. Dazai stared right back, nonplussed. Blaise gave him a little tug. "This was a bad idea," Blaise whispered in his ear. "Let's go." "What?" Dazai blinked, brows furrowing harshly. "I can't leave now." Percy spun around to face them. He placed a hand on one shoulder each, Blaise and Dazai, and didn't pull off even when Dazai made a disgruntled face. "You can, and you will." Dazai ignored him. He wrenched his shoulder back until Percy was no longer corraling him. "Everyone will get too cocky if I just run away," he said. "The Port Mafia is not a bunch of good-for-nothing cowards. Not for the first time this school year. That rule was going to land Dazai in a world of trouble. But there was no backing down from a challenge. And anyway, wasn't this the kind of hysteric fear Mori wanted? It was only up to Dazai now to weather the blow. "Get to—" Percy stared at him, wide-eyed as if trying to translate Dazai's meaning. He shook himself. "Forget it. You will leave now, here." He again placed a hand on Dazai's shoulder. His grip was tighter this time and clearly meant to say, "You will do as I say." Doing this, he turned both Dazai and Blaise around and began marching them towards the door. "And you will not leave your room until another prefect comes to tell you it is safe." 100 eyes bore into their back. Dazai thought he could feel them. "Leaving without a word, huh?" Percy did not stop shoving him out the door. even when Lockhart called over the crowd. For the second time, Dazai squirmed out of Percy's grasp. The prefect cursed and immediately tried to grab him again, but Dazai could be slippery when he wanted to be. He turned around and gave Lockhart a massive grin. "And you only wait until I'm leaving to say something, hero?" Lockhart's sparkling smile flickered, briefly, into something red-hot. He covered it quickly. Now. Severus here seemed to have everything under control. "God forbid you have to actually do something for once, sir," Dazai said. Again, another paper-thin crack in Lockhart's otherwise perfect facade splintered. Dazai chuckled for effect but felt it sounded a little brittle. The hero and the villain. And no matter how you looked at it, Dazai was certainly the villain here. But the role of villain fit Dazai best. His blood was mafia black after all. Lockhart was no hero, but surely he was at least human, which qualified him in ways Dazai couldn't match. But regardless of how well he fit his role, Dazai couldn't help the way his shoulders drew together, and the corners of his lips pinched slightly. All eyes were on him, and Dazai couldn't stand it. When he tried to brush this discomfort off, he let his one eye darken into something miserable. Black. Mr. Dazai, Snape, and Percy warned at the same time. Lockhart laughed boisterously. Dazai might have flinched if he weren't steeling himself up like a traitor in the torture rooms down below Port Mafia headquarters. Lockhart, unflappable in this regard, gestured for Dazai to come to him. He was still standing by the very front of the great hall, just below the stage whereupon the staff ate. The table had also been cleared from this area. Such bold words for an illiterate demon. Lockhart chortled. He continued waving at Dazai when he didn't come forward for several seconds. Come. If the beast invites itself to our training grounds, surely it comes expecting a fight." Dazai stared. Then, he took a step forward. Lockhart beamed terribly, and Blaze whispered something sharp at Dazai's back that he couldn't make out over the sudden rumble of the crowd. A low, warning growl slipped from Snape's throat. It was so strangely animalistic that Dazai briefly stopped walking to shoot the man a bemused look. "Gilderoy," Snape growled. "You cannot fight a child." Lockhart scoffed. "I am about to commit an act of great heroism for the people, Severus." "Bah, just consider this a practice round. Will that satisfy you? You don't want to train him, you want to hurt him," Snape snapped. Lockhart's eyes nervously flashed in Snape's direction, but he was all show a second later. He grinned imploringly to all his fans. "Listen to the voices of our students, Severus. They're all just begging me to save them. Isn't that right, children?" It was silent for a moment. Then a voice from the crowd. "Yeah." And just like that, the dam broke loose. "Expel him. Beat the demon in a duel. Kill him. Now. Quick. The villain. Our hero." The cheers grew louder and louder until Snape's complaints could no longer be heard. Lockhart's smile seemed to grow in proportion to his fans' enthusiasm, and by the time din had reached eardrum-breaking levels, his smile looked practically maniacal. He kept beckoning Dazai forward. Now his wand was out in one hand. Dazai forced his heart to still. The shouting, the close quarters, the eyes. He pushed it all away into the furthest reaches of his consciousness. Because emotions like that were sloppy. Sloppy like leaving behind a half-burnt letter, or giving Mori the opportunity to set his dragon loose on the school. Dazai was an executive now, and sloppy wasn't an option. A true mafioso, Pomfrey's frozen body proved it, proved what he needed to be. So Dazai very carefully felt nothing when the crowd roared loud enough it vibrated under his skin. This was the job. Snape was still yelling something that Dazai couldn't hear. At some point, he had begun stomping after Dazai towards the main stage, but not before Dazai came to a stop just before Lockhart. The students were giving them a wide berth. "Gilderoy," Snape's yell echoed above the din. Like banging a gavel, the outrageous yelling suddenly quieted. There was still a rumble of conversation around them, but nothing so deafening. "Severus," Lockhart huffed. His whole demeanor befit someone putting on a show. "Mr. Dazai brought himself here. It's only fair to show him his place." Someone whistled in the crowd. Snape stormed across the room, and finally came to a firm stop just in front of Dazai. "Do not pretend you mean only to treat him as another club member, Gilderoy." Lockhart laughed. "Very true. I am only a teacher's second, after all." Dazai inched around Snape so they were standing side by side. Snape shot him a severe glare, lips pulled into a thin line, but otherwise did not move. Predictably, Lockhart needed no prompting to continue. "First and foremost, I am a champion of the people." This hung in the air for a few seconds. Then, half the crowd shouted out their support. Percy stared at the masses, wide-eyed. Dazai saw him at the corners of his vision, trying ineffectually to quiet the students. Nearby him, Blaze was glaring daggers at Lockhart. The unusually emotional fire burning in him had Dazai briefly stupefied, and at some point, Draco had also entered the Great Hall to stand with Blaze. Their whole demeanor was shadowed with something dark and piercing, pointed straight at the showboating, oblivious defense professor. Then, Lockhart spoke again, and stole Dazai's attention back to the main conflict at hand. "As such, it is my primary duty to save these poor children from the demon in their midst." Lockhart waved his arms in a flourish. His wand jutted out, and Snape and Dazai both winced. "Of course, I will protect them from the petrifications by defeating the basilisk this demon has set loose. But first, wanna bet?" Dazai chirped. A great hush fell over the students. What was a roar before would now betray even the sound of a pin dropping. Snape's head snapped to him. "Problem child, shut up," he whispered. Lockhart blinked several times before recollecting himself. "Pardon me," I said. "Wanna bet?" Dazai smilingly took a step forward and out of Snape's protective shadow. Snape cursed. "I bet," he said, "I can kill the basilisk before you can, O mighty hero." A series of low whispers lanced through the crowd. A single bead of sweat slid down Lockhart's chin. He laughed nervously. "Defeat the monster you set loose? I hardly—" Dazai lifted a brow. "You're a coward, then? You won't even try?" Lockhart's face flushed red. He sent several frantic looks to the students around them, then barked, "Of course I can kill the basilisk before you." Dazai nodded, his entire mien suddenly quite smug. Lockhart ground his teeth so hard Dazai thought he heard something break. When Snape cursed something else at his back, Dazai spoke louder to ensure his message would reach every ear. "Only the winner has a right to call themselves champion of the people." Dazai named his prize. "After I defeat the basilisk and save Hogwarts from its plague of petrifications, I'll expect you to call me that." Several people in the crowd choked. "Ha!" Lockhart sharped a little manically. "I won't lose to the likes of you." Isn't that right, my adoring fans?" This time it was a breath of several seconds before the students rose up in agreement. Dazai's bravado had summoned attention in the room. "Mr. Dazai," Snape warned, "do not dig your nose deeper into this mess. I'm trying to protect you. So you haven't changed your mind about me?" Dazai thought with a jolt of surprise, even knowing what I am. That realization lingered for only a second, warm like honeyed tea. But when Dazai looked over his shoulder and saw the sheer panic on Snape's face, he felt cold once again. And only once he had met Snape's eyes head-on did he declare, "It's a deal, then. The basilisk defeated, and I don't get expelled." He tried to project this thought with a steady stare. Snape's eyes widened minutely. Then Lockhart was laughing again, and Dazai had to look away. Lockhart was sparkling as ever, but something about him now seemed a little harried. Dazai grinned at it. "Ah, what a shame. We can't duel now," Dazai said. "If you want to beat me fair and square, defeating me early is just cheating. I think your book will be lacking for it." "Nonsense," Lockhart faltered, but Dazai could see it in the way his eyes lit up, and he surreptitiously glanced to the gathered students. He agreed with Dazai's reasoning. The basilisk bet was a better chapter for his story, and defeating Dazai now would kill the tension. Or some other nonsense. Honestly, Dazai hoped Lockhart choked on his book. Lockhart shook his head like he was steadying himself. Afraid to be defeated in duel, aren't you? Well, I suppose I could have pity on you. If you're going to be a coward, then I'll duel Dazai, Pansy yelled across the crowd, pushing her way through Crabbe and Goyle's mocking laughter. She already had her wand out. Snape bristled at Dazai's back. Lockhart blinked several times, bewildered, before grinning twice as wide as he had before. He clapped. Perfect. This lovely young lady can teach Mr. Dazai just what my dueling club is all about. He said teach with the affect of someone who really meant put him in his place. I will not allow— Psh! Please, Severus. It isn't like she's actually going to hurt him. They're both only children, after all. Pansy's eyes were burning with a livid ferocity, the same look she'd been wearing ever since winter break ended. Duel me, Pansy reiterated, voice firm. Her wand was held straight out. At that angle it was unmitigably a weapon. Drop the wand, Snape warned. No, no, no. Lockhart hushed giddily. Let them fight. It's a perfect plot for Chapter 5. Gilderoy, you are not helping. Dazai ignored their bickering. Instead, he watched Pansy dully. The wand, still aimed straight at him, quivered slightly in the air. She seemed to be breathing quite heavily. But Dazai could tell it wasn't fear shaking her hand, only anger and desperation. He told her, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Pansy, I don't care enough about you to want to draw your wand. Every word was emphasized with a stab of her wand in the air. Waving it around like that is bound to get someone hurt, Snape had told him several months ago. Dazai grit his teeth. Guess someone was getting hurt then. He mustered up some charm for show, then said, There's never any convincing you, Pansy. Convince me with a duel, she spat. Dazai nodded dourly. When he withdrew his wand from his coat, Snape sucked in a breath. Problem child, put your wand away. Both of you. Dazai blew him off. He held his wand out, just like Pansy's. Good, she said. Good. Lockhart, one hand on Snape's shoulder to hold him back, had a laugh like a child's. Well, it's not the proper way to start a duel, he said, but it's certainly dramatic. Now you two, as supervisor, I have to remind you that I'm in no way responsible if you maim one another, okay? Neither Dazai nor Pansy blinked. A ripple of unease stilled the crowd. Percy was watching with wide eyes, and a twitching stance like he wanted to run forward. Near him, Blaise and Draco looked ill. Then, without further ado, Lockhart paused. Let the duel begin! His voice boomed out across the great hall. Pansy moved immediately. Immobulus! Cold and sharp energy burst out from Pansy's wand. Dazai felt it before it fully cast. Thinking quick, he narrowly dodged the beam of stabbing blue magic. His hair whipped frantically. The spell missed him by an inch. It collided with the wall a moment later. A fracture of ice spawned over several rows of brick. Stay still, damn you, Pansy cursed. She threw her wand out wildly. Immobulus, immobulus, stabbing, freezing. Dazai ducked to the left. Both spells flew wide over his head. Somewhere to the side, Snape swore, This isn't a duel, this is a brawl. Snape lifted his own wand in defense, but before he could cast any counterspells, another blast of Immobulus had him staggering back several feet. Pansy stomped forward. You ruin everything. She shrilled. You ruin my friends, you ruin this school, you can't even get spelled properly. Incendio. Fire fanned out of her wand tip. The flames were massive, large enough to burn even the bystanders several yards away. Screams poured out from around them. People ducked and ran to avoid being seared. A clamor of feet pounding on stones sounded like even the most enthusiastic of cheerers was now desperately attempting to flee the great hall. Dazai closed his eyes and braced. If I don't dodge, he thought, heart thudding, no longer human will. He twisted his wand. Invia obis, Dazai cast. He'd only seen it cast once before, by Professor McGonagall. But he remembered how it felt, the cool, calm wash of the spell, the result like 1,000 tightly wound knots. A wall of blue rose up from the floor and covered half of the entire great hall. He felt a sudden pressure in the base of his skull, but it was only pushing and not stabbing. A reminder of his limitations and nothing more. The massive burst of fire exploded against the shield spell. It kicked and roared and groaned. The air was sticky with heat, but the shield held. The fires burnt away. Dazai breathed out. Shock flashed across Pansy's face. Her wand hand dropped for just a second. Dazai leapt at the lapse. He threw off one glove, nullification poised. He bolted through the Invia Obis barrier, dispelling it with a wave of his wand hand to disguise the power of no longer human. The wall vanished in a shimmer of blue lights. Pansy screeched. She stabbed her wand out again. Expelliarmus! But Dazai was faster. He grabbed her wand arm. Expelliarmus crackled under his palm. No longer human killed it. Pansy froze. She blinked into his eye, aghast. Dazai dug his fingers into her arm. His nails broke skin. Blood. With a great force he yanked. Snap! A crack echoed. It was silent for a moment, then Pansy screamed. She dropped her wand immediately. It clattered on the floor and rolled several feet away. Screaming, Pansy cradled her wand arm. The arm hung limply in her hold. It was bent out at a strange angle halfway through. Broken. He'd broken her arm. Pansy just kept screaming. And screaming. She was done, wand forgotten to her pain. No more frantic spells left her mouth. Just one continuous agonized howl. The duel was over. Once it was clear that he had won, Dazai took several steps back. Pansy didn't react to his giving her space. She only hunched further into herself, and slowly sunk to the ground. Dazai put his wand away before turning to the crowd. All of the dozen or so students that remained were staring at him in horror. Dazai looked to Lockhart instead. The defense professor was as pale as a ghost, and looked just as horrified as the children. He gawped silently for a number of seconds. Snape shifted beside him, and Dazai looked to him instead. "You," Snape said. His voice was raw but tight with severity. Dazai blinked up at him. "Go back to your dorm, now." He didn't wait for Dazai's response before rushing to Pansy's side. He muttered the spell Episci, and although the bleeding stopped, the arm was still decidedly broken. "Shit. Poppy, we really need you," Snape prayed under his breath. "Please." Dazai eventually had to look away. Lockhart was still shaking where he stood. "Good luck, hero," Dazai said to him. Lockhart made a sound like a squeak. With that said, Dazai turned to leave the room. The other students parted for him, an obedient sea. Even the hushed murmurs faded as he passed, silence in his wake. Percy, Blaise, and Draco were still standing together by the door. When he came to them, Percy nodded stiffly at him. Dazai braced himself for a scolding. "You..." Percy paused, bit his lip, then haltingly continued. "You need to be more careful." Dazai blinked, shocked. But that seemed to be all Percy had to say. As a moment later he dismissed. "Now get out of here, and try to lay low, please." Dazai watched him for another short moment before acquiescing. Immediately, Percy stepped away and rushed to Snape's side across the hall. Dazai felt the flicker of Episci a moment later. When Dazai turned back to the door, only Blaise was still there. Draco was no longer at his side, and had evidently left the great hall without a word. "Hey," Dazai greeted. Blaise looked him straight on. His frowning demeanor no different from its usual, but there was something strange lingering in his eyes. He glanced over Dazai's shoulder to where Pansy was bent over herself, howling, howling, howling. Dazai's brows pinched. "I've had my fun," he told Blaise. "Let's get out of here." Blaise met his eye. Then, ever so slowly, he shook his head. "No. I'm going to stay with Pansy," he said. Passive, as if these words were the same as any other. "You go on without me, Dazai." Without another word, Blaise stepped past Dazai and into the fray. Across the room, Dazai couldn't make out what Blaise said to Pansy. But when he kneeled down beside her, Pansy let out a shrieking sob. Dazai stared, something constricted in his stomach. But everyone was afraid of the demon student, and Mori's plan continued to be an uncontended success, so Dazai supposed what he was feeling must be relief. Chapter 26. It was several days when he next saw Pansy face to face, but it looked like she hadn't slept in months. Pansy's eyes were drawn and sad, underlined by dark bags. She seemed to always be frowning, And although Dazai could say with certainty that she had never really smiled at him in the first place, there was no denying that something about her had changed. A weary blanket had settled over her, making her entire being seem limp and dreary. Even her cloak was wrinkled. All week, Dazai had spied her slumped over in her seats and not taking notes. Though Dazai supposed note-taking would be difficult for Pansy, seeing his dominant arm was wrapped up in a sling. Dazai had worn casts on all of his limbs before, though never all at once mercifully, and while he knew it was hardly comfortable, it also didn't warrant Pansy's moping. Dazai thought this, now, watching her from across Great Hall. After the dramatic resolution to Lockhart's dueling club, all future club activities had promptly been cancelled on the spot, and by the next morning, the tables and chairs had all been pushed back in place. Like nothing ever happened, even Pansy's ice spell had melted from the wall, completely clean, back to normal, status quo. Daily life had subdued into the usual grind of classes and slander that Dazai had grown used to at the start of his second year. People continued to give him a wide berth. The Daily Prophet continued to speculate. But an unmistakable tension had come over the entire school. The teachers and students alike all sensed it, and moved from class to class with the wariness of a prey animal waiting for something to strike. Dazai felt it too, despite, ostensibly, being the predator in question himself. Evidently sensing eyes on her, Pansy sluggishly lifted her head. She met Dazai's gaze over the other tables and blinked once. Dazai did the same. Last time they met eyes like this, Pansy had looked ready to kill him. This time, Pansy pursed her lips and stared at him through hard eyes. The emotion behind her expression was indescribable. If he were anyone less, Dazai would have shivered to be the focus of such scrutiny. But he wasn't, so Dazai merely raised a brow. Ugh, Ron twitched beside him. Don't look like that. You're freaking me out. Dazai watched Pansy for a second longer, before turning his attention to Ron. Given recent events, Dazai had once again decided to forgo the Slytherin table in exchange for the slightly more accommodating Gryffindor one. I'm just looking around, he pouted, and what do you mean it's freaking you out? This is how I always look. Ron stuffed a ham and cheese sandwich in his mouth. A stern look from Hermione had him, hastily chewing before continuing, like you're up to no good? Nah, it's creepy, Dazai huffed. Pansy was staring at me, he said. I'm only returning the favor. He glanced back to the Slytherin table. Once again, Pansy had her head pointed down to the table. Millie and Tracy kept shooting her concerned looks that went entirely ignored. Blaise was also sitting next to Pansy, but the two of them weren't speaking at all. Dazai wished Blaise had sat with him instead. But ever since the dueling club, Blaise had been hovering more and more over Pansy's sullen shoulder. Dazai sniffed. Well, Hermione said from his other side, you did break her arm. It's understandable she'd be upset with you. People get their arms broken all the time. It's hardly worth moping over. I guess, Hermione hesitated, but not at Hogwarts. With Madame Pomfrey petrified, there's no one here to heal her. Honestly, I didn't even know they had muggle things like arm slings on campus. Dazai hummed, acquiescing Hermione's point. About Madame Pomfrey, he said, and Hermione nodded for him to continue. What do you know about that? She blinked. Just as much as everyone else. Did you hear what Professor Lockhart said at the club, Dazai? What happened? Ron's question was muffled by the sandwich half-eaten in his mouth. Professor Lockhart mentioned a basilisk, she said conspiratorially. I did a little digging in the library yesterday about basilisks. They have a petrifying vision and can grow to be twice as large as the Great Hall. Ron choked. No way! And there's one here? She nodded. The way Professor Snape looked at him, I think the whole basilisk thing is supposed to be a secret. So, I did a little more looking around the library. And you'll never guess what. What? Dazai asked, leaning forward in his seat. The basilisk information he already knew, of course, but otherwise he'd been too preoccupied with Port Mafia business to really investigate further. And beyond that, he wasn't entirely sure where to look, though he had half a mind to sneak into the restricted section of the library and try his luck there. Perhaps Hermione had done just that. Thinking this, Dazai asked her, The tips of Hermione's ears pinked. Well, not exactly. She trailed off, looking away. Dazai leaned into a palm, smiling smugly. You totally did. She puffed out her cheeks and took a bite of her own cheese sandwich to keep from responding. I can't believe you didn't invite me, Dazai moaned. But don't leave us hanging, Hermione. What did you find? It took another several seconds for her to look at him again. When she did, she was frowning apologetically. Sorry, Dazai. It's just... You've looked so tired lately, I thought maybe I shouldn't bother you. It was only a silly research project anyway. Tired? He looked tired. Dazai had thought Pansy was the dead-looking one among them, but now that he looked closer, Hermione was watching him like she was worried he might keel over at a moment's notice. Though, he supposed he had been feeling a little under the weather ever since winter break. He couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was that Mori's coat felt a bit like a blanket always hung over him like it was lulling him to sleep. Or maybe it was that the coat was heavy enough to be pulling him into the depths of the earth, never to be seen again. He ran a hand over his face to smooth out whatever exhaustion Hermione was seeing, regardless. Judging by her lifted brows, however, this was less than successful. Still, she finally told him, this Chamber of Secrets business, the basilisk and everything, it's all happened before. 50 years ago the chamber was sealed off after a student died. Well, the paper I read said an Acromantula was responsible, but knowing what we know now, they must have been mistaken. Can you believe it? Dazai took in that information with a dull look. Well, he thought, Riddle had certainly left that part out of his explanation. But why? Hermione fidgeted. Is that not helpful? She asked. Dazai frowned out of his musings. Helpful? Well, you said you were going to hunt down the basilisk, didn't you? Here, she glanced nervously at the staff table, where Lockhart, alongside an uncomfortable-looking Hagrid and Trelawney, was gesturing excitedly over his lunch. The cancellation of the dueling club had only seemed to make him more chipper over the last few days. Not that I approve, because I absolutely don't, Dazai. You're going to get yourself hurt. But if you're going to do this anyway, I thought you should at least know what to look for. Dazai blinked. For once, he wasn't really sure what to say, because that was helpful and nice, and she'd just done it without him even having to ask. What kind of exchange was that? Or was this how the boss felt when his subordinates took it upon themselves to preemptively take action against rival gangs? Actually, no. If Dazai's subordinates started a gang war without telling him, he'd probably lose his mind. But this was different. Benign. Ron snorted out a laugh and clapped Dazai on the back. He jerked forward at the force, letting out a guttural oomph. That only had Ron laughing harder. Now that's a face you should make more, he teased. Dazai blinked out of his surprise to shoot Ron a scathing look. You know we've got your back, Hermione said. Although a little heads up would have been nice. She paused, then asked, Are you really going to stop the petrifications? Dazai bodily shook himself, brushing off how his cheeks had dusted pink at the same time. He nodded. Think it'll clear my good name? I don't think that's likely, mate. Dazai deflated outwardly, but internally he knew this outcome was precisely what Mori wanted. Me neither. Still, Hermione and Ron shared a glance over his head. Dazai wiggled his fingers, feeling no longer human wriggling through them. He hovered the tips of his nails over his wrist where an old cut was itchy with healing skin, but didn't scratch it. He glanced up to the staff table. About the basilisk, what exactly are you going to do about it? Ron asked. Expectedly, McGonagall wasn't here. It had officially been over a week since Egg's return and Pomfrey's petrification, which meant it was time for Dazai's first remedial lesson with the Transfiguration professor. Dazai thought she was probably already in her classroom, preparing for him. If he wanted to get there anywhere near on time, he should start on his way now. Otherwise, by the time he finally caved and asked a painting for directions, the lesson would already have ended. That, and it gave him time to talk with Riddle. Hermione and Ron both followed his gaze. Dazai? He shook himself and smiled at them. "I have a plan, don't worry," he told them simply. Then, without any warning, he promptly stood up. They both startled at the sudden departure, and so did half the student body, which had apparently been privately watching him for the entirety of the lunch break. He grabbed a book bag from where it was sprawled carelessly across the tabletop. "Thanks for the info, Hermione. I'll see what I can do with it." Hermione moved like she too was going to stand up. "We can help." Dazai lifted a hand to stop her. "Maybe later. I've got a class to get to right now." He also had some more digging to do. Riddle must know something. But the diary was, supposedly, safely in Mori's hands right now. Somehow, revealing that he'd never let go of it felt like a betrayal. He couldn't say why. "Oh," Hermione pipped. "There he goes, sneaking around again," Ron said idly. He didn't sound offended, though, only that he was stating some obvious fact of nature. Hermione nudged him. "That's how I roll," Dazai told them cheerily, and Ron made an exasperated face. Dazai made a quick goodbye, and no one said anything of the uneaten meal on his plate when he hurried off. Navigating Hogwarts, as ever, was a nightmare at best, but Dazai was lucky to know where most of the secret passages in the school were, so it was only a matter of minutes before he was ducking into a hidden corridor between the Great Hall and one of the revolving staircases. He'd walked quickly through the halls to avoid being spotted by too many people, then faster still when he couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was being followed. But searching around only revealed students glaring at him, or running around corners the second he glanced their way. Damn, maybe he really was tired. With the secret stone door shut behind him, Dazai was securely alone, and also about halfway to where he thought McGonagall's office was. Now he leaned against the wall and drew Riddle's diary from his coat pocket. From another pocket, he took out a self-inking and black-feathered quill. He flipped open to the first page. It was empty like always, his and Riddle's last conversation having erased itself days prior. Dazai pressed the nib of his quill to the paper. It bled out from the point of contact. He wrote in stiff, tiny letters, "What happened 50 years ago?" There was no response for a few seconds. In the meanwhile, Dazai squinted down at his own writing. It was difficult to read in the darkness, and more difficult still with one eye newly blindfolded. There weren't any overhead lights in this passage, only a faint glow from a crack in the stone. Outside, Dazai could scarcely hear the hustle and bustle of Hogwarts, though whether that was due to the lack of students currently attending, or some sort of muting charm, Dazai wasn't sure. Dazai turned his focus back to the diary when Riddle's loose script appeared under his own. It took a few moments of screwing up his eyes to make it out in the darkness. "So your interest in the basilisk has not faded? You are a curious boy, Dazai." Dazai scowled down at the page. He explained, "It can't be a coincidence that you know how to control it. At least tell me how to find it." Research about 50 years ago might take some time, but he could do it. Riddle's other information, however, was clearly privileged. If it were possible, Riddle's handwriting felt smug. "As I've told you, the basilisk will appear wherever a suitable amount of blood is to be found. If you want to see it so terribly, try killing a small animal. Or cutting your arm open," Dazai, though blithely. "Once it's here, I can only sense it through the walls for so long it's too fast to track all the way back to its nest. I need to know where it comes from." There was another notable lapse in conversation. This one seemed to go on for far longer than the last one had, and Dazai impatiently affixed and reaffixed the end of his bandages while he waited. When Riddle finally responded, he only wrote one word. "Sense?" Dazai's fingers, gloved, ceased their fidgeting. He hovered them over the page instead, and Riddle wrote nothing more. He supposed this was as much confirmation as any that Riddle, despite being some form of magical entity, could not sense no longer human like the ghosts, goblins, and Coil had. As for Dazai's theory as to why, "You're a book," Dazai said. "You don't get to ask questions. I suppose I won't answer questions either then, shall I? And find yourself locked in my desk drawer for the rest of all time?" Another pause. This one lasted for only a few short seconds, How about a trade of information, Dazai? Dazai tapped the feather against his chest, then wrote, "You first." "I think not," Riddle replied easily. Dazai's eyes narrowed this time, annoyed rather than squinting against the low light. Riddle couldn't see this, however, and only continued, "What confirmation would I have that you would ever respond again? You could take my information and throw me away." "I might still do that now." Riddle wrote nothing, and Dazai sighed. "About as much confirmation I have that you'll answer me honestly." "Yes, but what do I have left but to talk with you? I gain nothing from keeping secrets. I am only a diary after all," Dazai huffed. Riddle was unbelievably awful to hold a conversation with. Still, Dazai supposed, given Riddle's situation as a spirit or something, who could ever be sure with this thing? Inhabiting a diary, sharing information with him, was probably the least risky thing he could do. After all, Riddle was right. Who else could he even share this information with? After a moment, Dazai penned, "My magical sensitivity is quite high. Now answer my question." "How high?" Dazai raised a silent brow. "High enough," he tapped the quill, then decided there was no harm in adding, "Have you ever seen a sensing stone before, Riddle?" "I've only read about them, I'm afraid. They're incredibly rare." "I take it you've seen one, though," he wrote. "What color did you see? Yellow? Paler?" "I'll tell you after you tell me about the basilisk," Dazai offered. On the page, Quirrell's ink drew a small circle. It was the kind of thoughtless gesture Dazai had seen in other students, when they needed to fill in the next test answer, but weren't sure just what to put. To see it in his sentient diary now gave Dazai pause. This was a real person, or some equivalent thereof, he was suddenly reminded. A living, real person doomed to sit still forever and ever in the pages of a book. No different than the painted people of Hogwarts, really. Except that they could at least look around their surroundings, shout obscenities at passerbys, and twitch about in their frames. Dazai wasn't feeling sympathy for Riddle necessarily, but there was a coiling discomfort in his gut about the whole situation. "Very well," Riddle eventually wrote back. "Then I will tell. Why, whoa, fancy book there, Snakey," George chirped from his left. "Let's have a peek." Fred popped up the right. Dazai slammed Riddle shut so fast his fingers stung. He stared at the twins, wide-eyed, and they blinked back, looking completely bewildered. Dazai cleared his throat. He made a point not to put Riddle's diary away, but he did hold it firmly to his chest. "You two," he said by way of greeting. "What are you doing here?" They both lifted a brow, looking perfect mirrors of one another. "Sneaking around, the usual," they said, and dodging Perk. "That guy is all over the place these days," Dazai hummed. Actually, he'd been thinking the same thing about Percy. Then George made a so-so gesture with one hand and admitted, "Actually, we were sort of looking for you." Fred nodded. "There's, something we need to talk about." Both of their eyes kept skipping curiously between Dazai's face and the diary. Clearly, they wanted to ask. Dazai said before they could, "It's a little creepy you found me so fast." The twins laughed awkwardly. Then, as explanation, Fred withdrew the Marauder's map from his cloak. He made quick work of unrolling it, and said magic passcode to make the ink appear. A second later, a scale image of the Hogwarts layout appeared on it. Dazai found his name, along with Fred and George's, easily. So they'd found him using this? It certainly wouldn't be the first time, though two things occurred to Dazai at once. The first, they had a guest. Waiting just around the corner, outside the hidden passageway, was printed the name Percy Weasley. He was in the main hall, and thusly couldn't hear their conversation or see them. But he was here nonetheless. Was it coincidence that the Gryffindor prefect was loitering nearby, or something more? Dazai's intuition, and a series of strange events surrounding Percy, had Dazai believing it was more. His eyes narrowed at the name, and he would have dissected that particular concern more if it weren't for his second realization. This second realization was far more pressing. Dazai focused on that one. The Marauder's map showed the twins where everyone in the school was at all times, and they seemed to make a habit of always keeping it on them. Last week, Dazai had petrified Madame Pomfrey. Did they? When Dazai looked up, he saw it on their faces. The twins knew. They had seen him on the map with Pomfrey just before she turned to stone. So Dazai did what he always did when backed into a corner. He smiled. Like I said, creepy. He leaned away from the map. A tickle of magic was coming off of it. Are you stalking me? No way. We're just... Dazai smiled a little wider. Sharp and not especially kind. Like I said, stalking. They both sputtered, waving their arms about in a frantic gesture. No, 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 George waved. We just like to, keep an eye on things. Especially you, since every time we turn out back, something big is going on. They paused, the frazzled energy not leaving them, but certainly mellowing out while they waited for a response. Now, Dazai did put Riddle's diary away. He slipped it into his robe inside pocket, secure, and made a disgruntled face. The emotion behind this expression was at least partially genuine. Right, he said. That still sounds a bit like stalking, but I'll humor you. What did you want to talk about? He already knew. Poppy Pomfrey. But playing the fool had always been his easiest crutch, though whether the twins believed it was something else entirely. They met his eye head-on. Then Fred and George nodded in sync. Okay, well, last week, after Egg got loose. How did that happen, by the way? We were watching you on the map. Just to make sure you didn't get expelled. Vanished into the night. Fred stressed, looking pained. Like, poof. George made an exploding gesture with one hand. Because, we would drop out if you left, boss. Dazai blinked. The loyalty strummed a chord in his chest. But he said nothing. We would, Fred agreed sincerely. He shook his head a second later, however, and continued seriously, so, I guess we'll just say it. You're doing that thing again? Dazai blinked. Again, this time more confused than the last. What? That thing where you sneak around and don't talk to anyone. His nose scrunched up, but only just a little, because he was only really waiting for the twins to finish dancing around the subject. We look away for a minute. Fred lifted a brow. And the next time we talk, you're halfway through making a gang and stealing an ancient artifact? I'm not stealing any artifacts at the moment, Dazai assured them. In fact, he had already finished the stealing portion of his school year, the diary now tucked away in his pocket. But that was neither here nor there. But you're stopping the petrifications, George butted in. He leaned forward into Dazai's face. Everyone is talking about what you said at the dueling club. Fred nodded emphatically. You didn't tell us about your plan. Totally not reassuring when you come up out of nowhere with some bonkers plan, boss. The opposite of reassuring. Concerning, they said as one. Dazai squirmed. He really hated it when his friends pulled his heartfelt nonsense with him. He crossed his arms. You two are as fussy as ever, he grumbled. Then he squared his shoulders and cut to the chase. I'm sure you're thinking about that map of yours. The day Pomfrey was petrified, I was there. Fred and George stilled, but they fixed themselves not a second later. You didn't say anything about it, George said softly. He pulled back, but was still watching Dazai with those worried eyes of his. We gave you a few days to come to the gang about what happened, but then you didn't, Fred finished. I didn't tell you, Dazai thought, because I petrified her. He couldn't say this, of course. Just being careful, Dazai told them half-heartedly. What, did you really want to know I was with Pomfrey when she... Here, he made the same exploding gazutra George had made a minute earlier. Ugh, Fred groaned. He's doing it again, George. George grumbled and half-collapsed his entire weight into his brother, walking off into danger and then not telling anyone. Brushing it off like it's nothing, when that's something anyone else would be completely traumatized over. They were looking at him like they weren't sure whether to coddle him before he broke apart or slap some sense into him. Both would be completely unbearable. Dazai huffed, feeling something red and warm dance over his cheeks. I tell you too plenty. Like you tell us about your secret meetings with Blaze and Draco? Dazai stiffened. Oh, come on, Snaky, we aren't jealous or anything, Fred said, and George continued, but we really do keep an eye on you. And you've been dodgy ever since the year started, even more so after winter break, Fred confirmed. Which is super concerning since it's you and... Dazai groaned, long and loud. It surprised the twins well enough that both their mouths snapped shut audibly. Dazai reached up to pinch the bridge of his nose, then recognized the gesture as one of Snape's mannerisms, and fussed with the bow at his neck instead. He pulled the ribbon taut. When I say you're the pranks and chaos people, I don't mean making chaos for me, he scolded them, uncomfortable. And you two are overreacting as always. Hey, now, I like to think this brand of chaos is nice. Dazai rolled his eyes, and the bad one twinged beneath its bandage. Then, he decided to take control of this conversation before they could up their fussing to an 11. Because Blaze always did that, and Blaze was terrible about it every single time. The last thing he needed was the twins jumping on that bandwagon as well. I saw the basilisk petrify Madame Pomfrey, he told them, watching as they both recoiled at the admission. He continued, when she was looking at my eye. Since she's not a bad person, and Lockhart is, I decided to kill the basilisk. Any more questions? Fred and George shared a look. Yes, actually, so many questions. Great, Dazai clapped, shutting them down before they could even get started. He turned to face the hallway he'd just come down. According to the Marauder's map, Percy should still be loitering around out there. I have a class to get to now, so if that's all... It's not... Yeah, I mean, why did you stay behind the infirmary well after Madame Pomfrey was petrified? Dazai stepped past them. He had to duck one of Fred's wild hand movements. If one of you tries to hug me, I'll scream. I was investigating, he said, meaning, I was cleaning up my own blood. Or, why didn't go Professor Snape with what you saw? He loves you. We're having a fight, Dazai said, walking faster. And how come you running away right now? Dazai swung open the door and hopped out onto the other side. Percy, he greeted over-enthusiastically. Long time no see. Let's catch up. Percy startled horribly. He staggered back several feet, one hand reaching for his wand, and the other clutching at his chest. Just a second prior, he'd been standing deflatedly in the middle of an empty hallway, looking around and seeming adrift. Now, he looked about ready to pop. Mr. Dazai, he breathed. You're looking for me. Sure, Dazai chirped back. He skipped over to the older Weasley, earning him a bewildered stare all the while. It was only after he waved a hand in greeting that Percy finally looked up and caught sight of Fred and George standing beside a door in the wall that certainly was not there a second earlier. Percy's brows pitched. Perk, they greeted, looking just as stupefied as he did. What you doing out here? Percy's surprise very quickly morphed into an expression more befitting a prefect. I could ask you the same. You two better not be causing trouble. He glanced again to where Dazai was standing beside him. Percy asked alarmingly, You aren't harassing Mr. Dazai, are you? Course not. Never the leal snaky. They're peer pressuring me, Dazai piped up, earning two gaping stares from the twins and a hardened look from Percy. George shook himself. Then, a little nervously, he told Percy's scowl, we're pressuring him into emotional vulnerability? Yeah, considering it's Dazai, that's basically free therapy for him. Percy's severe stare didn't unharden, but he did look a little more confused than before. Eventually, he turned to Dazai for his side of the story. Dazai ignored the unspoken prompt. Instead, he told the prefect, Walk me to McGonagall's office, Mr. Prefect, sir. Pardon me? I have a class, he said slowly, as though speaking to a small child. Percy's brows furrowed, looking not like he was insulted, but instead like he was struggling to make sense of what he was looking at. I don't know how to get there, he added. The secret passageway would get him there quicker than Percy could. But if his theory of Percy was right, Percy eyed him. We can walk you, the twins offered. You two, Dazai said, giving them each a significant look. He paused as if to consider his next words. Are busy talking to Blaze. They blinked. Percy beside him looked vaguely bewildered. We are? I mean, the kid is great, but we are? Dazai shrugged. You want caught up, talk to him, he said, and when both their eyes lit up with realization, he offered the smallest of grins. Hop to it, pranks and chaos. They stared. But after a short second, their expression lightened more enthusiastically than the sun. They bounced on the soles of their feet. Aye, aye, Cap'n. Great, now only point that chaos where I tell you to. Dazai reprimanded just as Fred and George ducked back into the secret passage. The door magically fused back into the wall only a second later, leaving only plain-looking brick behind. Dazai cursed. Those two never behaved properly. Fred was looking between him and the wall dazedly. I was under the impression you all got along, he said after a moment. We do, Dazai said with a nod. All my awful friends are worrywarts, though. I'm trying to train it out of them. Percy blinked at him confusedly. Then he shook himself, and a moment later he had puffed up his chest like the upstanding prefect he was. Come along then, Mr. Dazai. Professor McGonagall's office is this way. He took a step in some random direction. Dazai didn't know. When Dazai followed in place beside him, Percy turned forward and started them down a long corridor. As they walked, Percy frequently glanced his way, as if checking that Dazai was truly following, or trying to dissect what he was thinking about. Definitely, this guy was up to something. If his strangely hovering presence at the dueling club hadn't been indication enough, then this surely was. Dazai cleared his throat after the 10th not-so-subvert glance. The noise startled Percy so badly that he actually looked Dazai full-on for once. Then realizing what he'd done, Percy's head snapped back to the far wall. Hey, Dazai said, eyeing Percy's expression closely. Are you stalking me too? Percy gasped. A second later, his steps stuttered to a sudden halt. He turned to Dazai slowly and stared at him with wide, aghast eyes. He coughed out, What? Percy blinked. Wait, two? Dazai snorted at his expression. Percy seemed to bodily shake himself, and though he didn't make any effort to start moving down the hall again, he did let out a long breath. If you feel you are being stalked by you, Percy's mouth clamped shut, then I'm not stalking you, Mr. Dazai. You've been following me, he cut to it, for a while now. The dueling club, absolutely, but before that as well. Dazai could easily remember a few times he'd thought for sure he was being followed, only to find no one around. A flash of ginger hair in the corner of his vision, or Ron making some offhand comment, Percy. He was asking me about you yesterday. The weirdly accommodating way Percy had been treating him ever since Dazai had spirited Ginny away and stolen her diary. Ginny. She and Percy were quite close, weren't they? And at the time, hadn't he even said it? Maybe he also noticed Ginny has been acting strange lately? The puzzle pieces collided together with staggering force, but Dazai held his ground. You know, Dazai said casually. He started walking again, picking the same direction they'd just been going and hoping it was correct. Percy boggled him for a few seconds before hurrying to take up Dazai's side once more. He felt a small thrill of satisfaction upon having, evidently, chosen the correct direction. If you want to thank me, you only have to say it. The stalking is a bit much. Percy choked. He blinked repeatedly at Dazai like he thought the younger boy might have spontaneously gone entirely insane. I'm not stalking you, Mr. Dazai. Dazai's nose curled. Just call me Dazai. Only the staff call me that. Dazai, then, Percy amended a little awkwardly. He nodded, satisfied. It took another moment of silent walking before Percy next spoke. Along the way, they passed only a few groups of students, most of whom promptly went dead still as if to pretend they were. Statues. Dazai rolled his eyes every single time. He was only a little surprised to see Percy glaring every time someone recoiled from them. Mr. No. Dazai, Percy eventually said, voice low like he was worried they might be overheard. Dazai adjusted his own demeanor to automatically match. I do want to thank you. Let's hear it then, Dazai puffed up. Percy only sighed. He looked stressed, Dazai thought. Strange, considering that if anyone here should be at their breaking point, it would be Dazai himself. Last semester I knew something was wrong with Ginny. Only I didn't know what, and she wouldn't say anything about it. He looked away, shame flashing across his expression. I thought, maybe she's just having a hard time adjusting to Hogwarts? It wasn't until that Quidditch game I started to think, maybe Ginny is involved with the petrifications. Dazai filled in the blanks. He'd realized the same thing only a bit earlier than Percy had. He hummed. That was when I really knew. I overheard you and Mr. Zabini talking that day, Percy admitted. He winced apologetically when Dazai's eyes widened at the confirmation of his bubbling theory. Percy! Percy was the witness, talking about how you thought Ginny was involved. At first I was so angry you'd come to such a conclusion that I was going to tell Professor McGonagall you were guilty right away. But then a petrification happened, and you weren't responsible. So I let you go. Dazai narrowed his eye. You didn't tell the staff that I suspected Ginny, Mr. Witness. Again, Percy winced. No, it's the only time I've ever hidden something from the staff. A moment of silence lapsed between them. Then Percy continued. You came to the Gryffindor dorms a little after that. Despite what everyone says, my brothers trust you, so I let Ginny go with you. He looked up from where his eyes had fallen to glare into the stone floor. He met Dazai's eye. I don't know what you did. But within a week, Ginny was smiling again. She invited Miss Lovegood over to the dorms, slept in on weekends, read by the fireplace. Percy smiled fondly, his eyes gleaming the light of soft memories. Whatever you did, thank you. Dazai shuffled his feet awkwardly. They made a shuff-shuff noise on the stone with every step, and his cheeks heated up despite himself. He looked away. I didn't do it for her, he grumbled. Were all Weasleys this awful? Dazai needed a break from all of these emotional redheads. Didn't they know the whole charade would just make him sick? A heartfelt gratitude. Yuck, I'm going to make a run for it, Dazai thought. But where was McGonagall's office again? I know, Percy said. And that's fine. He eyed Dazai. Doing good things for selfish reasons doesn't make you a bad person. Dazai thought about what Blaise had told him all those months ago. I think you should choose to be selfish. He sniffed, eyes still trailing a thin crack in the wall. It wasn't nearly thick enough for the basilisk to peek through, but with a good enough force, it could be. Yes, well, I'm very selfish, Dazai said firmly, crossing his arms over his chest. Percy's brows rose, but he shook the expression away a moment later. He sighed. I'm grateful to what you've done for my family, even if I don't completely understand why you did it. So I'll tell you this, you need to be more careful, Dazai. Dazai looked away from the wall from shoot him a look. You said that the other day, because I'm hoping you'll heed it. Now he was watching Dazai with a look like he was imparting something significant. Dazai didn't know what to make of it. I'm plenty careful, he said, puffing out his cheeks. Percy gave him a dubious look. Whatever it is you've been up to with the basilisk, he said, dropping his voice somehow lower an octave. Dazai strained to make him out. The staff are all over it. Professor McGonagall asked me to keep an eye on you, and I know the other prefects were asked to do the same. Dazai cursed under his breath. Laying low won't get me anywhere, he told Percy, though the reasoning was mostly for himself. I'm just going to put an end to the problem, stopping the petrifications. So I hear, Percy said, sounding strained. Clearly he was recalling Dazai and Lockhart's argument a few days prior. Dazai couldn't blame him. His ears were still ringing just to think about it. He sighed. Can you not leave this issue to our professors? Nope. Percy made a noise Dazai had never heard him make before. A sort of grumbling like a bear, exhausted from heaving its own weight around all day. He planted a hand on his face and rubbed at his eyes, Merlin's beard. You hang around Fred and George too much, you think? Dazai asked, going for cheeky, but sounding very genuine instead. Around them, the halls turned from unfamiliar to unfamiliar again. Dazai was glad to have a guide. Percy nodded into his hand. When he eventually dropped his arm, he looked no better off. Okay. Look, Dazai, I don't think you realize how precarious your situation is right now. Dazai shrugged, and Percy made that bear-like grumbling sound again. It wasn't very prefect-y, Dazai thought. But I can see there's no talking you out of anything. Just be careful. And if you need anything, Dazai mimed, zipping his mouth shut. Plausible deniability, he said, thinking about back home in Yokohama, where sometimes you were better off not knowing the details of someone else's assignment. Otherwise, it would blow up in both of your faces. What? No. Percy blinked. You come find me, and I'll help you navigate it safely. He eyed Dazai, looking at once like he wished they'd never had this conversation at all. Stars above, is this how you always operate? I've always got a plan, Dazai cheerfully told him. Percy didn't look to believe him, but all the same, Percy nodded. Then, without further word, he suddenly stopped to knock on a door. Dazai frowned curiously. Come in, McGonagall's voice sounded from the other side a moment later. Percy turned the handle and gestured for a gaping Dazai to go inside. This is her office? Dazai blinked. I thought it was like... He gestured vaguely in a manner that could indicate any number of meanings. Percy lifted a brow. Not here, Dazai finished lamely. He dropped his hand to his side. Percy gave him an odd look. Do you really struggle with navigation this much? I thought the twins were joking. Dazai pouted, and Percy only continued to stare at him. Eventually, Dazai decided to grin cheerily at him before promptly slamming the door in his face. He heard a shocked grunt a second later, but Dazai paid it no heed. He whirled around. McGonagall was standing beside her desk. She looked as though she was just about to get up to greet them at the door, before Dazai had slammed Percy out. She had one hand braced on the desk and the other in the air. Now she watched him, a little bewildered. A moment later, though, her eyes narrowed in thought. It had Dazai immediately on edge. She knows about Port Mafia, he reminded himself silently. He prepared himself for an interrogation. But after several seconds of silent staring, McGonagall did no such thing. She sat back down and gestured for Dazai to do the same. Just like in his lessons with Snape, there was a single chair set up opposite the professor's desk. Dazai settled in it. His coat puffed up around his waist. He put his book bag on the floor beside him, all the while not taking his eye off of McGonagall. He looked around. McGonagall's office was a touch neater than Snape's. There were still plenty of books and papers spread throughout the room, but not so haphazardly. Diagrams indicating various transfiguration matrices were posted on the walls, or folded up and sitting in a bookshelf. Curiously, Dazai noticed several clumps of black fur in the corners of the room, as though some furry animal frequently took up residence here. Dazai racked his brains to recall if McGonagall had a pet, but came up short. Regardless, it tickled his nose uncomfortably. Besides that, a single steaming cup of what smelled like coffee was on the desk. Dazai eyed it with some displeasure. Wasn't he going to get a cup, too? Snape always made him tea. Transfiguration, McGonagall said suddenly, drawing Dazai's wandering gaze back to her. She was frowning at him sternly, apparently disapproving of his snooping. The transformation of one matter into another. You should remember this from class. He blinked. So she wasn't going to mention Port Mafia? Dazai rolled his shoulders and hid a satisfied smirk behind something more teasing. She had accepted his deal after all. The basilisk for her silence. Thank goodness. Dazai didn't want to have to mastermind another petrification so soon. What a hassle that had been. McGonagall's stare drilled into him. Right. I've read a few books, Dazai said. She lifted a brow, clearly not missing the way he'd not really answered her prompt. And Hermione lectured at me for a few hours about the wand work. McGonagall nodded. She didn't look satisfied, but she didn't look unsatisfied either. One-on-one like this, she was actually kind of difficult to read. Then, with one hand, she withdrew a match from a small box on her desk. Dazai groaned audibly when she set it in the blank space between them. McGonagall eyed him sharply. Match to needle, she began, and Dazai whined again. One of the simplest transfigurations, due to the object's already similar qualities. You've seen this cast before many times. Cast it yourself now. Dazai pulled out his wand obligingly but made a show of it. He slowly dragged his hand through his bag, idled with the wand for a bit, twirled it lazily between his fingers. And by the time he actually got around to looking at the match again, nearly a minute had passed of him grumpily getting to it. All the while McGonagall said nothing. She only waited with seemingly endless patience for him to wield the wand properly. Dazai aimed his wand at the match. The tiny splinters popping out of it seemed to mock him. "This is useless, you know," Dazai told her. "This spell is the bane of my existence. Try it," she told him, nonplussed. "I will be able to see what you are doing wrong, and guide you appropriately." "Snape said I did it just fine. Professor Snape is not an expert in transfiguration," she countered. Dazai snorted, recalling his final lesson with Snape. "Don't tell him that—" Rather than respond, McGonagall tapped the desk twice. Just beside her finger, the match sat and did nothing. Dazai glared at it. Match to Needle was quickly becoming his least favorite spell, sitting right beside Verdimillious for how useless it was, and Modus Subtilis for the 100-something times Snape had made him cast it before moving their lessons forward. Might as well get this over with. Dazai gave his wand a proper wave, and channeled all his focus into how transfiguration spells always felt for him. Predictably, nothing happened. He looked back to McGonagall to ask her what he was doing wrong, only to find her watching him strangely. "What?" he asked, drawing his wand back defensively. She said nothing for a long moment. Her expression kept narrowing, then searching over his wand, the match. Whatever McGonagall was thinking, she was obviously deeply considering it. For a split second, Dazai's mind traitorously suggested that she was finally going to snap and say something about Port Mafia, but she didn't. McGonagall hummed. Once more, now it was Dazai's turn to make a face. He tried again anyway, once more shaping the magic and watching it do exactly nothing. The match didn't even shift its position. Dazai thought he might hate matches actually. "Interesting," was all she said. Dazai set his wand down, the useless thing. McGonagall continued unbothered, her eyes only flicking over to clock the movement, before turning again to watch Dazai. By all accounts, the cast itself was perfect. She tilted her head. "What were you thinking about?" Dazai glowered. "I already did this part with Snape. I'm focused on the right thing. You are a student, you do not know what the right thing is," she sternly reminded him. Dazai shrugged. "You studied your matrices?" she asked. When Dazai nodded, McGonagall picked up the match. She twirled it between her fingers. After a few moments of silent consideration had passed, McGonagall said, "Severus told me you had improved considerably with your magic." Dazai bristled. "It's just transfiguration that's not working," she hummed. It was strange. McGonagall had an uncompromising demeanor, but she never seemed harsh. Stating an observation then considering it before moving forward, Dazai supposed Snape had a similar methodology, albeit with considerably more glaring and sniping at one another. On the reverse of that, Mori's lessons tended to involve smiles, and Father's his fists. After a pause, McGonagall very suddenly said, "In via obis." Dazai blinked. No magic rose up around McGonagall, and no shimmering blue wall formed between them. She hadn't channeled any magic into the spell. This gave Dazai some pause. He looked at McGonagall curiously. She continued, "I hear you cast that spell the other day." He nodded, stupefied as to where this was going. "But that's a charm, not a transfiguration." "True," she said. "It is also not a spell taught to students. Why did Severus teach it to you?" Dazai tilted his head. Was she trying to glean something from Snape's teaching style? If so, this was a poor question. "He didn't—" McGonagall frowned. "You couldn't have learned such a spell from a book alone," she poked him with a severe stare. "I learned it from you, ma'am." A beat of silence passed. McGonagall's eyes widened, then narrowed noticeably. "When would I have—" She blinked, and again that wide-eyed astonishment colored her mien. "Mrs. Norris." Dazai snapped his fingers, glad to be on the same page. It seemed useful to know a defensive spell, so I decided to copy it. Good thing, too. I think Pansy was planning to burn this whole place down. You practiced a high-level spell without a mentor based on only one example? She asked, this time stern in a way that told Dazai he'd probably broken some unspoken rule of wizardry. Don't steal other people's spells. Noted. I didn't practice, Dazai told her. It was just the only defensive spell I could think of. Again, a moment of silence. McGonagall's mouth dropped open. By this point, McGonagall's shock had turned to scolding, had turned back to shock, into outright awe. She almost looked impressed, Dazai thought. You mean to say that was the first time you cast in via obese? Perfectly? In the heat of a duel? Dazai shifted in his seat. The praise might have had him preening if it weren't underlined by the ever-obvious you definitely should not be able to do that. A phenomenon that always had Dazai feeling like he needed to backpedal. So backpedal he did. Well, Professor McGonagall just makes Such a good teacher. I learnt it on the spot. It is a high-level spell, she said. How? Dazai didn't let his emotions show on his face, but he was a little peeved to find out that McGonagall couldn't be distracted in the same way Snape could. A drawling voice and a few irritating words was usually enough for the potions master, and if not, Dazai could always just start bold-face lying with him. McGonagall, however, had a severe look about her like she couldn't be shaken off. Even her posture was exact. Are you sure it's high level? Dazai asked cheekily. It seemed pretty simple to me. McGonagall frowned. Something like reconsideration flashed over her expression, though she said nothing of it. She tapped the match against the desk. It made the barest of sounds. Then, she waved her hand in an alluring gesture over it. Dazai felt the magic in the slight undulation of her fingers. A wave rolling to shore, then back out to sea. Before his eye, the match elongated, thinned, and turned to shiny silver. One end sharp to a point, and the red head bulged out to form the needle's eye. Dazai leaned forward to watch. The transformation and the way the magic rolled was captivating. Sitting before him was undoubtedly a perfectly formed sewing needle. After a few moments, the match, or it was a needle now, he supposed, though the acute logistics of one thing becoming. Another entirely was a little difficult to wrap his head around, remained further unchanged. Dazai looked up to find McGonagall was watching him curiously. He cleared his throat and fell back into his chair. It was wooden, and looking a little worse for wear, so it creaked at his weight. You didn't use a wand, he thought aloud. She agreed with a stiff nod. As an expert, and a teacher of this particular spell for many years now, I no longer need one for minor transfigurations. You always use one in class, Dazai said. Students will be using wands. Therefore, a wanded example is best, Dazai hummed. That made sense. Although, but not for me. She inclined her head, eyes briefly flicking to a complicated-looking poster about transfiguration theory before shifting back to Dazai. Then, she sighed. Severus was right. You are a curious one, Mr. Dazai, at Dazai's asking, and honestly a little offended. Look, McGonagall continued. You seem to be capable of great things, and yet simple spells trip you up. Why is that? No longer human buzzed idly in his brain. No clue, Dazai lied. Neither have I any, McGonagall said with a scrutinizing look Dazai's way. He smiled, the picture of innocence, and she huffed out what could have been a laugh or a sigh. But then she looked away. And we won't know, until... McGonagall trailed off, but Dazai caught her meaning well enough. Until Pomfrey is cured. Dazai couldn't tell her that Pomfrey would never be cured. Not if he had his way. He only smiled thinly. She shook herself. Regardless, an unusual student requires unusual methods. Let us try this. We will break the transfiguration process down into individual steps. From there, we will conclude exactly where the issue lies and proceed accordingly. Dazai nodded. That sounded reasonable. McGonagall pulled a new match out from the box. Dazai made a noise like he'd been stabbed. She shot him a quelling look, and Dazai whined, Can't we at least do something else? Like button to beetle. Hermione told me about that one. It's beetle to button. And I should hope you learned about that spell during class, Mr. Dazai. Oh, sure, that too. The transfiguration of living beings is infinitely more complex, she indicated to the match and needle both. Charms may come easy to you, but for this subject we will stick to the basics. Hermione said beetle to button is a beginner spell. Miss Granger is passing her class. You are not. Worth a shot, Dazai grumbled. He glared at the match like it was his sworn enemy. Then, he imagined his actual sworn enemy's gleaming face in the eye of the needle, and hated that one more. Lockhart was the worst. McGonagall tapped the table again, this time with more force, as if to say, pay attention. We will start with something simple, she said. Elongate the matchstick. Dazai looked between the match and McGonagall's transfigured needle. Sure enough, the needle was a bit longer. He raised his wand and gestured it at the correct angle. Then, he channeled his magic into that rolling, revolving field transfiguration was supposed to take, and willed it. Be longer, be longer, be longer. It didn't get longer. The stupid match was just as stupid and small as any other match, except for McGonagall's match, which was currently a needle. At his blank look, McGonagall merely said, "Make it sharper." Dazai ground his teeth and did just that. Or he tried to do just that. Turn it silver. Dazai did not. Form the eye. Dazai set his wand down and leaned back into his seat. He folded his arms over his chest. Across the desk, McGonagall lifted a single brow. The match was completely unchanged. This is useless, Dazai said. McGonagall's expression sharpened into disapproval. Giving up after the first attempt is not conducive to growth. I had thought by this point you would understand this, Mr. Dazai. Dazai squirmed. I knew I'd figure those other spells out eventually, though, he argued. Transfiguration was just different. He didn't know how, but it was. Who wants a pointy silver match anyway? Can I get an exemption for transfiguration? McGonagall only continued to eye him, clearly discontent with him. Her eyes narrowed, and she tapped her fingers along the desk in a random rhythm. Dazai watched her right back. He didn't like the way it looked like she was dissecting his every thought. It wasn't as dangerous a look as Mori's, but it was uncomfortable all the same. Dazai wasn't sure whether she made him want to try twice as hard so she'd back off, or give up twice as fast until she got sick of him. Either way, the match wasn't going to be turning into a needle anytime soon. Eventually, the tapping stopped. She dragged her finger along the table until a short, unpainted nail was pointing at the needle. Dazai frowned, unsure where she was going with this. Mr. Dazai, please return this item to its original form. Dazai blinked. He looked down at the needle, then back to McGonagall just as fast. And ruin all your hard work? She only tapped the table again. Right, he said. Guess there was no getting around it. Dazai picked up his wand again. He waved the wand, and imagined strongly in his mind how the match used to look. Short, fat, and where the eye was, now there had before been a red swell on the one end. It was supposed to be a snappable wood, rather than the slick silver it wore now. Dazai saw this image so perfectly in his mind he almost thought he could touch it. The match as it should be, the match as it was. Dazai stared down, transfixed, as the needle did just as he'd envisioned. It shrunk and dulled and popped out a little red tumor for fire-making. Even the shiny silver had dried up into a pale wood. He could see the grains in its make from here, and looking closer revealed the same tiny splinters coming off it that he remembered from before. A match. A match-toe needle to match. He'd transfigured something, and his head didn't even hurt. Wow, Dazai said. And although his words were biting and insincere, he couldn't shake the twist of genuine surprise in them. I turned your match back into a match. How useful, but still. He'd done it. Only Dazai didn't exactly know what he'd done differently. The spell felt the same as it always did, and he'd moved his wand in precisely the same manner. The only change was that it had actually worked. McGonagall lifted the needle match from the desk and rolled it around in her fingers, inspecting. There was something appraising in her expression that Dazai naturally disliked. She ran her nail along the edge of the match, and one of the splinters flew off with a nearly inaudible snap. But there was no denying that it was indeed a match once again. Thoughtfully, Dazai looked to his wand hand. "Now," she said, setting down once more a needle. Dazai nodded, feeling more confident now. He did exactly what he'd done the last time. Envisioned the needle perfectly in his mind, how it looked and might have felt under his hand. The magic turned and... Nothing. Nothing. Dazai tried again and again, to no effect. He scowled down at it. "What the hell? How come?" "I suspect," McGonagall said suddenly, drawing Dazai's smoldering attention back to her, "that I know the root of your dilemma." Dazai grumbled down at his wand. "What is it?" She plucked the match off the desk, forcing Dazai to cease his glaring at it. When they met eyes, he forced his expression to soften a little. Ever so slightly, not as disrespectful. "You have a mental block." "Okay." Now Dazai was lost again. His face must have betrayed this thought. "The fundamentals of your casts are perfect, and you clearly have the necessary focus. Severus tells me you're actually quite smart, so I'll assume for now you understand your matrices well enough." This was accompanied by a pointed look. "Now, it isn't particularly common, but some young wizards can struggle with magical aspects outside of those functions." Dazai frowned, waiting for her to continue. She collected both matches from the desk, and with quiet, precise hands slipped them back into the matchbox. Dazai watched all this impatiently. "Like what? What was so special about transfiguration?" "A mental block," she said again. "You aren't able to properly conceptualize the processes behind a transfiguration. This is more common with young wizards who are muggle-born, and tend to be very logical thinkers. A match is not a needle, and magic cannot change this fundamental fact, is what these types of people may think. Hence why you can magic the needle back into its original form, but cannot turn the match into something it is not. For some, the illogical nature of transfiguration seems insurmountable. Would you say this describes you, Mr. Dazai?" Logic was one of Mori's favorite words to throw at him. He shrugged. McGonagall nodded as though he'd answered yes. "Transfiguration is different from other magics. It is not the shaping of magic, or the balancing of potions. It is the base alteration of the world itself. One thing into another. Do you understand?" "I get it," Dazai replied, a little petulantly. He could spit the textbook verbatim back to her, and he still wouldn't know what he was doing wrong. She sat up, and Dazai got the feeling that they were done for the day. Her next words confirmed this. "Your homework for this lesson," she said. Already she was drawing a stack of ungraded Year 5 essays to the blank spot in front of her. A wave of her hand summoned a self-inking quill. "Meditate on the subject of transfiguration. Try to relate the subject to something you personally experience or understand. This is the basis for lifting your block. Something he personally understands." Dazai suddenly recalled his early lessons with Snape, how realizing modus subtilis was similar to Mori's scalpels had helped him to make sense of the example-less spell. Still, if modus subtilis is a scalpel, then transfiguration is just stupid. "We will meet again in 2 weeks, McGonagall said, oblivious to Dazai's growing annoyance. He blinked. 2 weeks? Snape and he had met every week like clockwork. She didn't look up from her essays, only marking something down with red ink beside a crudely drawn matrix. "I am far too busy with my other obligations to meet every week. So use this time wisely." Dazai sat there for a moment longer, before McGonagall dismissed him. He gathered his things and exited at a leisurely pace that would have driven Snape mad. When he left, the halls were quiet and still. Transfiguration, the transformation of one thing into another. But for all Dazai thought on it, he came up short. After all, whether he was wearing Hogwarts robes or Mori's coat, he was still the same underneath. A demon. And no transfiguration could fix him of that.
Thank you and subscribe for more Bungo Stray Dogs fanfictions. Let me know what was your favorite scene.